Morning, church. Hope you're all doing well this morning. Can you please turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 8, which is going to be our passage for today. So I've been allocated the entirety of Mark chapter 8 to preach on today. Now, I don't feel like I can do justice to these verses of Scripture by attempting to exposit all of them in 30 to 40 minutes. On the other hand, by simply brushing lightly over the text, I will not have done my job to present you with a proper understanding of this portion of Scripture. For this reason, I will look to address the three sections of Jesus' teaching and leave the more straightforward narrative sections for your own reading and study. So as we endeavour to look at these sections of Jesus' teaching, we notice three distinct emphases. Firstly, spiritual blindness, verses 11 to 21. Secondly, spiritual sight, verse 27 to 30. And thirdly, spiritual discipleship, verses 31 to 38. So first we're going to touch on spiritual blindness. And for this emphasis of Jesus' teaching, we are brought to a particularly strange passage. So let's read Mark chapter 8, verse 11 to 21 together. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" And what we see here is the blindness of the Pharisees and the blindness of the disciples. So the permanent blindness of the Pharisees, that is an important distinction, the permanent blindness of the Pharisees. Here we see that the Pharisees asked Jesus for a sign. Many people came from near and far to the place where Jesus was so that they could see signs or miracles that he was performing. At this point in his ministry, he was about as popular as he ever got. As far as doing miracles in front of the multitudes, it is. Men and women from all over would come either to be healed of disease, have demons cast out of them, or to experience with their own eyes the miracles that Jesus was performing on others. And at face value, it may seem like on this occasion, the Pharisees wanted to come to be amazed by the miraculous power of this man of God. But it's actually quite the opposite. The text says they began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. They wanted him to do a sign so that if he fails or does something that goes against tradition, they could discredit him. Just like we've seen with when Jesus healed the man on the Sabbath day and the Pharisees condemned him. Jesus' response here is that no sign will be given to this generation. In the book of Matthew, he gives the fuller account and he says this. This is the parallel passage, so the Pharisees have asked exactly the same question. And Jesus says, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it, said Jesus to the Pharisees. You see, the Pharisees were so focused on the things of this earth, temporal things like weather. They even looked through this lens when observing Jesus' miracles. They saw the miracles of Jesus and could not even see them for what they really were. That is, signs to authenticate his teaching and to show him to be the Messiah and the Son of God. Instead, they interpreted a multiplication of bread and fish as a bigger lunch, or healing a man on the Sabbath as law-breaking, and Jesus forgiving a paralyzed man of his sins as blasphemy. And here they are asking for another sign so that they can trap him. This right here is the attitude of spiritual blindness that is permanent. When the more exposure one has to Christ, the more they see of him, the harder their heart grows. The greater their hate of him becomes. The Pharisees, when confronted with the light, ran deeper into the shrouded gloom of their self-righteous traditions. Red sky at night, Pharisees' delight. Red sky in the morning, Pharisees' warning. The issue is that they were better meteorologists than theologians. They could predict a storm from the colour of the clouds, but they could not see the glaringly obvious signs that Jesus was the Messiah. That is why Jesus didn't go out dishing miracles on request, because it was only going to continue to distort their interpretation of who he was. So secondly, we have the temporary blindness of the disciples. So next up, we have the second part of this obscure little passage that we've read. And from this point on in the Gospels, Jesus is no longer looking to do any miracles or teaching in front of large crowds, but is instead focusing on the training of the 12 to prepare them for when he has left earth and commission them to go and preach about himself to all nations. So Jesus is in the boat with his disciples and is teaching them about the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And in the New Testament, this idea of leaven or yeast represents influence. Jesus is teaching the disciples to beware of the influence of the Pharisees and the influence of Herod. We've already touched briefly on the influence of the Pharisees. They were full-time law keepers. They spent all their time studying the law and keeping the law. Not just the law though, but traditions and what they called the oral law, extensions of the 613 commandments in the Torah. And they would take all these laws and traditions and impose them on others and themselves. And it was very intimidating. They would make people feel like all they would have to do is to do all of these good things to be a good Jew. However, as we discussed before, by doing this, their focus was on the temporal matters, the matters of earth. It was about being seen by men doing the right thing. Jesus is warning the disciples to not be influenced by these temporal things. What really matters in the end is what we do before God, not what we do before men. He wants them to focus on spiritual and lasting things and not on the temporal. In this case, that is recognizing Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. And that's why he says to watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. The second warning here is to beware of the leaven or influence of Herod and his followers. Now, important background understanding here. There are many Herods in the New Testament, but Jesus is specifically referring to Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas is different from the Herod who had the babies killed when Jesus was first born. This Herod ruled the part of Israel up around the Sea of Galilee and also some area to the east of the Jordan River, and he was known for his immoral behavior. Despite being Jewish, he openly invited the moral influence of the Roman culture and the Herodians, that is his supporters and followers, and they were corrupted by these activities. Here at Antipas, as an example, was the one who had John the Baptist put to death after being seduced by his wife's daughter. So on the one hand, Jesus condemned traditionalism and legalism, while on the other hand, he condemned immorality. So when Jesus provides this important teaching on bad leaven and how it can permeate the truth, what is the response of the disciples? Verse 16, and they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. No bread? Were they even listening? Jesus clearly wasn't talking about physical earthly things like bread. And this shows the blindness of the disciples, that their minds too were set on the temporal things of this earth. And Jesus rebukes them. Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said 12. He said, and 7 for the 4,000. How many baskets of broken pieces did you take up? Do you not yet understand? The Pharisees were blind to spiritual and earthly and eternal things. They are not understanding the teaching of Jesus. They are looking through the temporal lens of earthly matters, just like the Pharisees. And Jesus gives a yeast illustration, and they think he's talking about bread. Their stomachs are doing the thinking for them. And this is the spiritual blindness of the disciples. And we can see this in other parts. Jeff touched last week on how the disciples had hardened hearts toward Christ. How at the end of chapter 6, when when Jesus walks on water to the disciples on the boat, and he hops in, Mark says, they were utterly astounded, but they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. However, unlike the Pharisees, we see in the case of the disciples that they are not permanently blind. For the Pharisees in their permanent blindness, the more they experience Christ, the harder their hearts become. But the disciples in their temporary blindness, the more they experience Christ, the more they begin to understand who he really is. And he finishes with a rhetorical question here. Jesus says, do you not yet understand? And it's a rhetorical question because the disciples clearly did not understand. However, he says, not yet. The not yet implies that eventually they will see and understand, though it will not come easily. Unlike the Pharisees, their problem is not that they refuse to see, but that they cannot see until after Jesus' death and resurrection. Maybe you have a temporal and earthly outlook on life. Maybe you feel like you're spiritually blind. Perhaps if Jesus said to you, do you not understand? Maybe you'd say, that's right, I don't understand. Then I encourage you to seek to understand who Christ is and submit your life to him. Let this blindness be temporary blindness and not permanent. Do not harden your heart to the words of Jesus this morning. So now that we've touched on spiritual blindness, let us move on to the second emphasis, spiritual sight. So now we come to the crux of the passage. In fact, this is the climax of the book of Mark. Let's read Mark 8, verse 27 to 30 together. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist. And others say Elijah. And others, one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Jesus asked the disciples the most important question that anyone can be asked. No question is more important than who is Jesus Christ? Because how you respond will determine your life today, tomorrow, and it will ultimately determine your eternal destiny. Jesus first asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And this question is not really the one that Jesus cares about. It's like a two-part quiz in which the first is more like the practice question or the warm-up, with the second being the real deal. The first part got them ready, and the second part of the quiz is where the marks come from. So he begins by asking the disciples who other people say that he is. The disciples relay the rumors of the crowds to Jesus. Here we're talking about what the general public think, what the Pharisees think, what Herod thinks. We have mentioned how Herod had John the Baptist killed on behalf of his brother's wife, whom he had married. Now, when Herod heard about the teaching and miracles of Jesus, he thought that this was John the Baptist come back from the dead. Other people thought that he was Elijah or another prophet. In other words, that he was a good teacher, but nothing more. Many even acknowledged that he spoke on behalf of God, but they didn't think that he was God in the flesh, and they didn't think that he was the Christ or the Messiah. And for us too, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who other people say Jesus is. Young people, it doesn't matter if your parents say that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. It matters who you say that he is. A few weeks back, we had a church service all together, and 2 young men got baptized, the McIntosh brothers. And when they shared their testimonies, they talked about how for many years their faith was not their own, how they piggybacked off their parents' faith, and then how they came to the realizations that they themselves needed to answer the question of who Jesus is, not just take their mum and dad's answer. On the other hand, it doesn't matter if your parents say the opposite, that he is just a made-up person, or that he's a good teacher who lived and died a long time ago. What matters most to you, young person, is who you say that he is. What matters most to you, anyone, is who you say that he is. So on this note, Jesus then moved to the second part of the quiz, the real question, the one that you get the marks from. He then asked the most important question you can ask anyone, and he says to the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And it's important to note here that when Jesus is speaking to the disciples, he uses the plural sense of the word you. He's speaking to all the disciples. So to put it into New Zealand English, he might say, "Who do you all say that I am?" He asked the question personally to each of the disciples. And when Peter answers, he's right on the money. Speaking on behalf of the 12, he says, "You are the Christ." Or in the parallel passage in Matthew 16, he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And by this he declares 2 things. Firstly, that Jesus is the Messiah, and secondly, he is God. And you see, it's important to understand that this particular passage wasn't placed here in the book of Mark as just another story in a collection of random stories of Jesus' life. But the Gospels are written with a purpose. This Gospel is written to help us answer this question, who do you say that Jesus is? And I'll prove it to you. If you take things right back to the beginning of the book of Mark, in chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." You see, Mark explicitly states who Jesus is, and then proceeds to write this gospel to show that very fact, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And it's not a comprehensive account of the life of Christ. It's not a random selection of stories, but each portion was carefully selected and written down so that we can understand who Christ is. And what I mean when I say this, that this passage is a climax of the book, is that it has been building up to this point by showing us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And for those who haven't realized who he is up to this point, it now tells us that Jesus is the Christ. The word Christ, it is important to know, is not Jesus' last name, but it is the Greek word for anointed one. The same concept as they would use for Messiah in the Hebrew language. The Messiah is someone who is prophesied in the Old Testament to be a ruler and a descendant of David that will defeat evil and save Israel. They also acknowledge that he is the Son of God. They have seen him calm the sea, and in the middle of a storm they asked, "Who then is this, that even the sea and the wind obey him?" They knew that he was not a mere man, and here acknowledge that he really is the Son of God. And it's important to note that while the disciples have recognized Christ's deity, the fact that he is God, and his messiahship before, this is the first time that they have done so with conviction. Not a hope-filled expectation, but a heart-fixed conviction. So we've seen the permanent blindness of the Pharisees, and we've seen the temporary blindness of the disciples, and then we've seen how they have moved towards understanding of who Christ is. And maybe like the disciples, you see a picture of who Jesus is that is inaccurate, or at best incomplete. Because if he is who he says he is, if you really believe that, then it is radically life-changing, as we will find out in this third emphasis. That is spiritual discipleship. And here's where the rubber meets the road. This is where what you say is backed up by what you do. Let's read Mark chapter 8, verse 31 to 34. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me." In this final section of the chapter, Mark touches on two contrasting mindsets as Jesus continues his teaching here at Caesarea Philippi. On one hand, setting your mind on the things of man, and on the other hand, setting your mind on the things of God. So firstly, setting your mind on the things of man. This is one of the most shocking turnarounds in the entire Bible, here in verse 27 to 33. How could Peter, who one moment is saying Jesus is the Son of God and Messiah, all of a sudden be rebuking that very man? And while it seems very backward to us, it is actually quite understandable for the disciples to have this reaction for two reasons. Firstly, the disciples are still blind to some degree. They do not always understand what Jesus meant when he is teaching. We saw that when they were in the boat. They do not yet understand what they mean themselves when they make claims about who Christ is. And that's the second point. The disciples, even though they have proclaimed Jesus to be the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God, they do not fully understand what those things entail. They do not have the benefit of hindsight like you and I have. They cannot go and read the writings of Paul or go to the end of the book and see that Jesus really does suffer and die. They only have their Jewish teaching that they grew up with. And it's important to understand a Jewish view of the Messiah. The Jews thought that the Messiah was going to rise up, to take command of the Jewish people and rid the land of Roman occupation. And Peter and the disciples confess Jesus to be the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah. This is where their mindsets are going, a military leader. So when Jesus lays out his program of rejection, suffering, death, and resurrection, it is very difficult to reconcile this with what their expectations of the Messiah were. While to us reading this today, it looks like it is Peter who's doing the 180 turnaround, from confessing him as the Christ to then rebuking his program as the Christ. Peter and the disciples thought that it was Jesus doing the 180 turnaround. that Jesus had just claimed and showed himself to be the Messiah, and then said that he would die at the hands of his own people. So it would have been very confusing to them. So then Jesus turns to the disciples that they can all see and says, "Get behind me, Satan," to Peter. Now it seems a little harsh, you'd think, but at that moment Peter was influenced by Satan and joined in the devil's goal to keep the Messiah from the cross. And you'll notice that Jesus says a very similar phrase in Matthew 4, when he himself was being tempted by Satan in the wilderness. Remember back when Satan was tempting Jesus by offering him all the kingdoms of the world? He was doing so to stop Jesus dying at the cross so that Christ can receive things at the proper time. And interestingly, after the temptations in the wilderness, it says, Satan departed from him until an opportune time. The temptation in the wilderness didn't stop. The temptation didn't stop in the wilderness. It continued throughout Jesus' life, including here with Peter's rebuke, and also in the Garden of Gethsemane too. Even though Satan still moves around here on earth tempting people, he ultimately has no power and knows his eventual destruction at the right time. So it seems like the disciples were so shocked at the statements of Jesus' suffering and dying that they didn't even hear him mention rising again. The disciples were focused on the things of man, that is, their own desires of what the Messiah would be, liberation from Rome, military conquests, and this distracted them from God's plan. And really, it's not just the disciples that had this problem. We have this problem too. We can get caught out, setting our minds on the things of man. We can get distracted by our careers, trying to make money. Perhaps God wishes to place us in a particular job, or to use our time to serve, but we convince ourselves, nah, this is where I'm supposed to be. I love this place. God must want me here. Perhaps when raising children, we want our children to be more successful than the other children around them. So we set our minds on these things so that we can be seen by others as being good parents. There's a plethora of ways that you might be setting your mind on the things of man. But we must instead be looking to remain in the will of God. Every day we must be praying to God, your will be done, and submitting ourselves to where he wants us to be and what he wants us to do. And there's certainly freedom within the will of God. It's not like I'm praying, God, what's your will? And he's saying, brush your teeth, then go to work, then go to football training. There are many things that we can just decide to do. But if you're genuinely saying to God, your will be done on a regular basis, then your heart will be sensitive to the prompting of the Holy Spirit. Then we will be setting our minds on the things of God. And you get the feeling that if Peter had this response here, that of a heart open to the will of God, then when Jesus told the shocking news of his death and suffering, that the rebuke or the response of Jesus would not have been given. If Jesus told him about his suffering, death, and resurrection, and Peter humbly said, your will be done, Lord. Reveal to me my part in your will. Then Jesus would be commending him instead of saying in verse 34 to Peter, you are not setting your mind on the things of man, but on the things of God. Once you're no longer setting your mind on the things of man, the second part of spiritual discipleship is setting your mind on the things of God. So we go from setting our mind on the things of man and not of God to once we are spiritual disciples, then we are setting our minds on the things of God and not of man. So let's read this final part of the passage, verses 34 to 38. He has just finished rebuking Peter that he has been setting his mind on the things of man and not the things of God. Then he gathers those around him closer and uses this opportune time for teaching. Let's read these verses now. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So spiritual discipleship has 3 steps. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow him. If you're a follower of Christ, then you will be marked by these 3 traits. You will be someone who denies yourself. You will be willing to take up your cross, and you will follow Christ wherever and forever. Let's drill down into what each of these things mean. Firstly, deny yourself. Please note an important distinction here. Jesus asks his disciples to deny themselves. He does not ask his disciples to deny something from themselves. And here many Christians have badly misinterpreted this idea and have denied themselves of food except for bread and water. Or they've denied themselves of marriage, or they've denied themselves of material possessions and lived on the streets in rags. But no, these things are not a requirement of a disciple. God wants us to enjoy earthly blessings. That's why he provides them to us. But what is a requirement of a disciple is to deny yourself of yourself. This means to deny the self of self-promoting ambitions. It relates to what we've been discussing already. In the prior section, we saw an example of Peter setting his mind on the things of man. We saw Jesus clearly say in the negative that we saw Jesus say in the negative that he should not do that. Here Jesus further reinforces that in the positive, saying what we are to do, that is to deny yourself. Secondly, he asks his followers to take up their cross. This would have been an extremely surprising statement for the disciples to hear. Take up your cross? And because for us, we are somewhat desensitized to the cross. We see a meaning in it that the disciples did not. We look back and say, oh yeah, take up your cross, just like Jesus took up his cross. On the other hand, the disciples didn't have any role model that they looked up to who had been crucified. That was reserved for the crooks and criminals, the worst kind of death you can die. Again, Jesus is not saying that to be a follower of him, you have to go and get yourself killed. But he is saying that a follower of him is prepared to suffer the worst kind of death that one can die. And I think that we all sit here thinking, yeah, I'm prepared to suffer and die if God called me to go to a dangerous place. But maybe we haven't thought about it as realistically as we ought to. There's a tribe from one of the northern regions of Indonesia called the Batak tribe. And years ago, a missionary couple came to the village to share the gospel. And at that time, the tribe was 100% Muslim. The tribal leaders captured the couple, then murdered and cannibalized them. Years later, another missionary couple came to the same village and also shared about Christ. And the tribal leaders recognized the story as the same as what the first missionaries had said. This time, they listened and believed. Within a short time, the entire tribe was converted to Christ. And now, there are more than 3 million Christians among the Batak tribe. Would you be willing to be that first missionary couple? Would you be willing to be killed and cannibalized so that those who come after you can see people come to Christ? What if this kind of sacrifice is what it will take for many of the unreached people in the world who do not know Christ to give their lives to him? And it's not only Jesus who is teaching this. There were few apostles who took up their cross to the extent that Paul did. He's walked the walk, he can talk the talk. He says in Philippians 1 verse 29, "For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake." I mean, imagine telling people that when you're leading them to Christ. Not only do you get to live with Christ, you get to suffer for him too. You really do. It's been granted to you. And often persecution is what actually leads to the growth of the church. And it's clear from countries where Christianity is illegal that there's huge growth of believers. Because people are suffering, they do not have the tag-along Christians, but only those who know Christ for who he really is and are willing to give up their comfort and safety for that. When we really see Christ for who he is, then we will deny ourselves and we'll be willing to take up our cross for the sake of him. Then what do? The third command: follow him. Disciples of Christ follow him. They follow their master. They don't follow their heart. They don't follow a side of the political spectrum. They don't follow a philosopher. They follow Christ and his word. And the image here is a rare sight, a procession of disciples following after their master, each carrying a cross. The imagery means disciples must obey his teaching, including what he says about giving their lives. Not only does Jesus state the three traits of a disciple: deny yourself, take up your cross, follow him, but he also explains why. My wife Yakane is a school teacher, and we've talked about on numerous occasions the importance of a teacher not just stating something and expecting the students to remember and obey, but explaining why. And here, where Jesus is teaching these three important truths, he expands on why we should deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. And he says that in verses 35 to 38. Why are we to deny ourselves? Verse 36. Because what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Nothing. It's disastrous. Why are we to put aside? This is why we have to put aside our desires, our self-promoting ambitions. Because at the end of the day, what is the point in having a great career if it's at the expense of God's will? What is the point of having lots of money to spend on earthly pleasures if it is at the expense of God's plan? Nothing. Because even if you had all the riches in the world, it is nothing compared to the worth of knowing and following Christ. Why should we take up our cross? Verse 35. Because whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for the sake of Christ and the gospel will save it. Those whose sole aim is material well-being and security will lose the one life that is worth living. Those who sacrifice for others gain it. And why should we follow Christ? Because whoever is ashamed of Christ and his words, of him Christ will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father. If you really know Christ, if you really know him as Messiah and the Son of God, then you will not be ashamed of him. You will not be embarrassed to know him. You will not be embarrassed in front of your friends or colleagues to not join in what they're doing because it does not align with your Christian convictions. You will say so boldly. You will not serve your own desires, but instead live in the will of God, and you'll follow his calling and obey his commands at all costs, even at the cost of your life, knowing that even if you lose it, you will only have saved your life that is worth living. Thank you.